Hey everyone, it's Crypto Dantes here. Quick word from our sponsor. Yes, we have a sponsor. It's an independent author named Chris Hannon who's penned an absolute cracker of a novel. It's called Orca Rising, and it's the acclaimed first book in a spy thriller trilogy shortlisted for the People's Book Prize. People are comparing it to the likes of Hunger Games and The Maze Runner. If you enjoyed those, you're going to love Orca Rising. So check it out. That's O-R-C-A Rising, Orca Rising on Amazon. And you can also buy it directly from the author himself. That's csjhannon.com/crypto. C for crypto, S for sugar, J for J, hannon.com/crypto. And Orca Rising can be yours for just 150,000 sats. Get it now before the price goes up. I'm in before the film writes.
Welcome to Crypto and Grill.
Welcome back, everyone. Let's Crypto and Grill. As usual, it's Crypto Dantes and Stig of the Pump. Stig, say hello.
Hello.
Excellent. Great.
How's
to
everyone
have
doing
you here.
today? I'm looking at a really nice rainbow over the London skyline.
Let's hope that is a vision of the future crypto space in general, a sight into the future. But enough horsing around. We've had a couple of sessions lately looking at potential applications of distributed ledger technology, but it's time to focus back on our first love, Bitcoin. And I think the groundwork that we've done previously with you, if you've listened to previous episodes, the Bitcoin Standard episode with Saifedean, the view of Wall Street from Caitlin Long and John D'Agostino, and even Pomp as well, then you should have a good understanding of kind of where we are in this and how Bitcoin fits into the current system. Murad and Masir and others that we've spoken to should have given you an insight into the history of money. And what we wanted to do today, we've got an amazing guest who we'll introduce in a second. We really wanted to put that case for Bitcoin being the apex predator. And that's, I'm not entirely sure where that phrase comes from. I can't take the credit, but I do love it. Bitcoin being the apex predator of money. So, without further ado, let's introduce our guest. It's Dan Held from Interchange. Dan, say hello.
Hey guys, thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for being
Really
here.
great to have you on.
Really appreciate this. So, Dan, why don't you, for our guests that maybe don't know who you are, it'd be great if you could just give us some context and an overview of yourself, what you do, what you did before you joined the crypto world, and what you're doing at the moment.
Yeah, so I first got into the crypto space back in 2012, and then moved out to San Francisco and got involved in the Bitcoin community out here. It was just a dozen of us. Did Brian and Fred from Coinbase, Charlie Lee, Jed McCaleb, kind of just this core contingent of really true believers in this kind of revolution that was going to come. And there wasn't any space, had no money. It was just kind of held together by the belief in like, hey, maybe this could be great. And March 2013 hit, and the price went from $10 to $260, and that was the moment when I decided I wanted to go build my first product, and that was called Zero Block back in 2013. That is the sort of equivalent of the Blockfolio in terms of popularity. And later that year, we would get acquired by Blockchain.com, and then I came on board there as the first product manager, hired by Nick Carey, the first CEO. And funny side note on there, he DM'd me on Twitter to ask if I wanted to talk. So that's how the conversation got kickstarted. spent a bunch of time with Roger too, because blockchain was one of his favorite companies that he invested in. And after that, worked at ChangeTip, which did micropayments over social media. Then I went to Uber for 2 years, where I worked on writer growth, led by Andrew Chen and the global data team. And then decided to come back to my first love, crypto, specifically Bitcoin, and really wanted to build something that I felt would last through a cold crypto winter, and landed on this accounting solution for institutional trading infrastructure. So that's what we're doing over at Interchange, which is essentially taking the back office accounting that every single fund, OTC desk, fund admin, and exchange have to do. And we take that, and we've already kind of built a solution for that process, and then utilize, instead of each one of them rebuilding the wheel.
Amazing. And it's really refreshing and interesting to hear that you've had a kind of previous career before going full time into this space, and then kind of using those experiences. How do you think your previous career or your previous jobs at Uber and other places have set you up to succeed in what you're doing at the moment?
Yeah, I think those had early in crypto, I stumbled and bumbled my way into success and failure. Not a lot of us knew. I mean, no one, in terms of product roadmap and direction on some of these startups before, it's always tough to know where to go. So learning about what founders, it's learning what people do, which is it's understanding how investors think. It's understanding how to build a good product development process. And that's through seeing what works and what doesn't work. And then at Uber, that was a fantastic what best in class looks like. What does a best in class product manager look like? What does a best in class marketer look like? And so, we even had professional negotiators. So that was pretty incredible. What does a best in class negotiator for contracts look like? Some of that was kind of fun. Let's put it this way: there's even like a theatrical element to it. But yeah, just seeing both at small scales what working at large scales, what best in class looks like, I think definitely colored in, how to approach starting a business, how to approach starting a startup. And so taking those in to make sure don't repeat the mistakes that we made a long time ago, while also taking those sort of like best in class practices and using that to execute properly.
So Dan, am I right in saying that you grew up in Texas as well?
That's correct. Yeah, I grew up in Texas and then moved out here in my early 20s. I'm out in San Francisco.
And do you think that had any... so actually, I love Texas. I think that's the one place that I would move to in the US if I could. I've recently declared as a Houston Texans fan, and Friday Night Lights, the sort of Friday night college football atmosphere. I think I'd probably have to move to Pflugerville, somewhere like that, just to bring reality TV home. But do you think, from what I know of Texas, do you think that it seems like a very fiercely sort of independent place? The sort of open carry gun laws, and I think just from what I've read or heard, it seems like quite a unique place within the US. Do you think that had any influence on your trajectory into the startup space and then into crypto and Bitcoin?
Yeah, good question. And a fun fact here before I launch into how that kind of molded me and my personality. I was actually an extra on Friday Night Lights, the TV show.
Amazing. Can I send you some gear to sign, please?
You see me for a whole of 2 seconds. It's a huge deal.
Your Hall of Fame in my book.
That's so great.
Yeah. So in terms of how Texas kind of molded my personality and my perspective, Texans are fiercely libertarian. Texas was its own country for 50 years before joining the United States. So that sort of culture of independence very much rings true today, which is funny because, that was like over 150 years ago. But Texans, in elementary school, you have to pledge allegiance to the American flag and the Texas flag, which, to the best of my knowledge, every time I've mentioned that to my friends from other states, they don't do that. So I think that's a very unique trait. Texans, of course, continuing along that libertarian path. Almost everyone owns a gun. I think people strictly believe in property rights, as you are legally allowed to shoot someone who's stealing your property, rather than shooting someone based on the threat of your life. So, Texans very much strongly protect property rights. Whether or not I'm not saying I agree with that or not. I'm just saying that's what it is. And so I think, and then also the spirit of hustle. The Texas weather is very harsh. Kind of that heat gets you moving. It's around 110 degrees Fahrenheit for a good 100 days in the summer. And so, you're kind of constantly being active, moving, hustling. There's a very strong build culture there. So I think all of that very much kind of influenced my skew to libertarian ideology, kind of being fiercely independent, believing in freedom. And that when presented with Bitcoin, Bitcoin, I was a big torrenter back in the day and found myself siding with people that were willing to break the rules. And when Bitcoin came along, I think the idea that you could buy something that was illegal online was really interesting. And I wasn't technical and I didn't know how it worked, but I was like, this is an example of what it can do. And that was really, really interesting. It's sort of like a good use case to show, hey, this is what immutability or hard to seize assets look like. And then once I dug down, once I went further down the rabbit hole, I was like, oh, wow, the monetary policies from the Austrian School of Economics. And I was like, oh, this is really cool. If Bitcoin had a central bank that chose an inflation rate at whim, I don't think I would have been interested. And so, kind of along that path, that libertarian path, Bitcoin had those traits. Bitcoin had the traits of being kind of a don't ask for permission, beg for forgiveness type of protocol. And that really, really got me excited.
Do you think, just to come in there, do you think that's having a material effect on kind of the popularity of Bitcoin at the moment? Because definitely more as we progress generally across the globe, I'm making a massive generalization, everyone's becoming more and more sort of libertarian or liberal in the way that they think. Do you think that kind of curvature is having an impact on actually the viability of Bitcoin and the potential future viability of it?
Yeah, I think Bitcoin's kind of like a glacier. It doesn't necessarily matter if you agree with the philosophy or not. It's going to keep moving and keep eating market cap. So in terms of, does it require people to believe in it? Not really. People will flock to it to find an immutable, hard to seize money as socialist policies become more popular across the world. So I think that just the functionality of it alone will attract adherence enough. I think they'll come for that and then eventually have to buy into the libertarian ideology, as that is a core functional requirement of Bitcoin, as no one can rewind a transaction or choose how assets are allocated other than the person who controls other than the individual that controls a private key. So it sort of forces people to believe in libertarian ideology, which I think is a good function, because libertarian ideology inherently is about consent and freedom. It's hilarious in California, where we believe in consent for your body, but we don't believe in consent about your money, which your money is a representation of your time and energy. So it is a representation of your body. So I think this is something where, yes, I would prefer if we can craft narratives that will resonate on different frequencies that are not just libertarian. And I think myself and others are trying to do that, where, Alex Gladstein from the Human Rights Foundation talks about how the Bitcoin is for freedom. And I think that's a great way to put it. And that really resonates with many different types of people, whether you're libertarian or not. I think a lot of people agree that freedom is a good thing.
Yeah. And an interesting side of that, and from our discussion with John D'Agostino, he was saying, actually, all everyone cares about is what Wall Street thinks about Bitcoin or what is going to do about Bitcoin. And that's the same in the UK as well with our markets. But actually, it may not be for them. It may be for everyone else across the globe.
I think asset allocators, whether it be institutional asset allocators or retail, will continually look and chase after assets that either bring them a great return or provide them some measure of protection against seizure. Coin, 21 happening events all make it a very good viral, give it a very good viral loop functionality to have speculative bubbles which bring in new waves of attention and then and the bottoms, the people that truly believe, stick around. And so I think when these asset allocators, I think Bitcoin doesn't really care who invests in it, but we would be remiss to kind of brush aside the 200 trillion in assets under management that are managed by institutional traders if they only move in 0.5% into Bitcoin, which is minuscule. And I think, if you could look at how they allocate assets in their portfolio, it's largely, how do I improve my Sharpe ratio? How do I improve my diversification? And Bitcoin represents a very it's a non-correlated asset that has had massive upside, arguably probably the highest performing asset in this century. And so I think they would be remiss not to invest in Bitcoin, even if they don't believe in it.
Agreed. Yeah. And so just you touched on it briefly there, Dan, but before we get really deep into Bitcoin, or a lot deeper into Bitcoin, what's your read on the current state of the economy, global economy? And do you think that Austrian economics has got a legitimate chance of becoming a more mainstream or more broadly and widely adopted mode of thinking?
Yeah, so I would encourage everyone to zoom out. The only way for us to effectively evaluate what's going on in the macro markets is not to look month to month or year to year. It's to look decade to decade and century to century. And that's where I find it hilarious that people look at a 1 year performance for Bitcoin and go, oh, look, it's failing. I'm like, you mean it's up 300x since 2013? I mean, how could you possibly come up with that conclusion? It's bizarre. Yeah, and so if you zoom out, there's a great report put together by Deutsche Bank, which is called A Journey into the Unknown, their long-term asset management study, where they look at 800 years of financial history. They go back as far as the data can go, and they look at inflation and deflation rates. They look at sovereign bond yields. They look at debt to GDP ratios. And this is truly a journey into the unknown. We have never had such a decade broken infrastructure in terms of like debt to GDP ratio or rate of inflation. We've never had it so broken before. And not only is it broken in some big countries, it's broken across almost all countries. And that's why Deutsche Bank wrote this, is they go, look, this is unparalleled. This has never happened before in history, other than brief periods of time during warfare, but never this bad in peacetime. And so you have that combined with, as well in the report, the rise of populism has never been higher than right before World War II. There's a lot of volatility on the horizon. Only the most anti-fragile monetary policies will survive. And that's what Bitcoin is Bitcoin was built to be this very anti-fragile currency. And its monetary policy ensures that the incentives have been aligned, that it will survive very, very stressful events. And that's why it survives such volatility and such early uncertainty. And so it was kind of built to be that super rigorous currency that can survive anything.
So what can you see being the tipping point then between this going from what people perceive as kind of a pet project for individuals to something that is widely accepted?
Let's make AOC president and see what happens.
Good. There was a great quote on Twitter, I think today, where I think it was one of the heads of Wells Fargo. She was quizzing and questioning in either a Senate commission or some kind of government forum, asking why Wells Fargo wouldn't pay for the damages due to some kind of oil leak, and the response was quite straightforward, but it was also alarming. The response from the bank was, "Well, we provide the financing. We don't operate the oil pipeline." So, yeah, the fact that you would want to hold a bank and a financing outfit accountable for something like that either just shows a lack of understanding and the thought that maybe you can finance everything by printing money, or she was trying to prove a point that perhaps she didn't quite land, but it was interesting viewing nonetheless. So without wanting to lead the witness here, let's assume we are on the precipice. We're approaching the cliff edge, and we are hoping to have actually a couple of separate sessions with economists over the next couple of months. But let's assume we're on the precipice, and at some point, as you said, the debt level grows too high. It cannot be repaid. High inflation starts to set in. Maybe the US dollar, the euro starts to come under some pressure. Maybe there's a call for a switch to a sound money, whether it's gold or Bitcoin or both. For someone new to the space, why should they care about Bitcoin? What does it mean? If I'm new into the space and I'm hearing about the notion of sound money for the first time, what's the best mental model to put in place to try and understand Bitcoin and what it represents?
Yeah, there's a couple ways to look at it. I think above all else, Bitcoin is a vote for you. It's a vote for you amidst a sea of uncertainty. You have politicians and bankers continually manipulating your life through voting in of bills that you have to pay for and central banks debasing your currency. Bitcoin is a vote for you. It's a vote for you to where no one should be able to take what's part of you, which is that money. That money is energy and time, and only you willingly, as a willing participant through consent, should give up that money. I'm not saying that people shouldn't pay their taxes. I think they should. I'm saying, once you've already paid your taxes, you deserve to keep that money preserved. And Bitcoin does that. And when it comes to other ways to think about in terms of a monetary policy, why Bitcoin versus why the existing financial system is, if you look at any period of financial history, it's ripe full of breaches of that trust with the central bank and the population. It's impossible not to look at a slice of time and find some central bank that's failing. So essentially what they're doing with your money is that they're printing more and more, which continually debases the value of your currency that you hold in your wallet. It's the reason why your grandfather could pay for, a stick of gum or a Coke for a penny, and you got to pay $2. That's a great example of how they erode the value of your money over time. And that may seem not that big of a deal because inflation is made to incentivize you to spend, lend, or invest. However, who has the moral right to tell you how fast or slow you should spend your money or invest your money? Who has the right to tell you that, we're going to erode your money by 1% a year and that will incentivize you, or 2% or 10%? And so, as we've seen, it's impossible to choose a proper rate of inflation, and all of these central banks are essentially driving a car in rearview mirror. You've got the central bank as the driver and the car as the economy, and the central bank is using information in the rearview mirror, historical data, and then looking through an extremely foggy dashboard, windshield, because you can't see the future. And then they have a really big delay on the brakes, the brake, gas, and steering wheel. And so it's essentially a blind person trying to drive the economy, and it's just not possible. So we've seen countless examples of this failing. I think Keynesian economics, if there was ever a chance for Austrian School of Economics to win, it's right about now. I don't know when the next financial crisis is going to happen, but central banks have all but exhausted. I mean, they're all preaching negative interest rates, which is absurd, and I don't think the mainstream populations will be very happy with that. They're reaching a point to where there's no other move. All the moves are done. I don't know when that's going to be. I don't know if it's in 2 years or 10. It might even be 20. These things take a long time to happen. And I'm certainly not preaching a doom and gloom sort of event. I think this is just a natural cycle of things. Central banks rise and fall. There's epochs of eras of certain types of governance structures that rise and fall. And I think in our modern day culture, there's probably going to be a lot less violence with this sort of changeover. And Bitcoin offers something that's super compelling, which is freedom for every person in the world to flee oppressive bureaucratic regimes. And so I think that's kind of the value prop for Bitcoin.
Thanks for that. And it's really interesting at the time of which we're seeing this, because Bitcoin came into life at a sort of seminal moment. It launched right in the middle of the last financial crisis. At the moment, if you look around the world, we're also starting to see a slightly different shift and more authoritarian governments taking control. And in China, the experiments that are going on there with social credit scoring. I think you mentioned Alex Gladstein earlier. If you've got a system or a digital currency that's controlled by a central bank, and assume there's no paper and everything is completely digital, I think not many people seem to realise the dangers that could perhaps bring in society, and the 1984 type of a state that could facilitate. So, what are your views on privacy within Bitcoin, within individuals, within money, and do you think that that's something that people need to educate themselves about?
Yeah, privacy is that's a hard one to convey, because a lot of people say, oh, if I'm not doing anything wrong, then I shouldn't have to worry about it, and that's not the right mental model to have. It's the fact that it gives the government power over people, and with that power, you can change the way that 400 million people think. With that power, you can change the flows of how their money moves, which that money is a representation of 400 million lifetimes. And any edit of that money edits the entire stored energy or stored time. Yeah, the stored time and energy of that entire population. There's nothing more impactful. So privacy brings a nice element, because with privacy, now the governments can't censor what you spend your money on, or how you vote with your money, because money is information, money is speech. And so privacy enables the individual to buy, sell things that they consider to be okay, and that they consider to be a transaction where there isn't, if someone knows you're buying a certain type of medication, or someone knows you're buying a certain type of product, you might not buy that product because you're afraid that people will know. And that could either be detrimental to your health, or it could be detrimental to like how you think. And so, and then as well, it could be used as leverage against you. And so I think, privacy is a core element of the future of money. Now, when it comes to people, when it comes to Bitcoin and how it's used there, I think with Lightning Layer 2 for Bitcoin, that definitely brings around privacy with the onion routing feature that it has. So that's, I think, really, really cool for Bitcoin. A lot of other coins have been experimenting with privacy on Layer 1. So in terms of implementation, privacy is easier to talk about, harder to implement. And I think there's trade-offs between having privacy on Layer 1 versus Layer 2, but I don't want to go too deep down that rabbit hole.
No, that's fine. So you mentioned a bit around education there. So how important do you think education is going to be in gaining mass adoption? Or do you think it's simply a case of the narrative will slowly speak for itself more and more over time?
Yeah, since there's no marketing team for Bitcoin, each conversion into Bitcoin was basically peer-to-peer. It's someone putting money into Bitcoin, that the price rising, and them telling all their friends about it, friends, family, coworkers, and it's sort of like the perfect viral loop. And so each person who prophesizes Bitcoin is essentially spinning up their own narrative. Now, granted, if everyone was sharing insights across which narratives were working or which ones weren't, we might improve our conversion rate into bringing people into Bitcoin as believers. But there is no centralized system or decentralized system for us to share learnings or share A/B tests of like, hey, we used this language on a Facebook ad and that converted people. That was sort of the experiments that we would run at Uber, and isolating all the different variables and seeing what messaging would convert or resonate with users. And I think again, Bitcoin is kind of like this glacier. It doesn't really matter if you believe in it. You just kind of have to. It's the highest performing asset. As an asset allocator, you'd be remiss not to add it to your portfolio, since it's uncorrelated and it's the highest performing asset this century. So it doesn't really matter if you believe in it. It's just a proper thing to do. I think, but in terms of the narratives, I think we are getting to a stage where the narrative is getting better and better and better. Back when I was in it, it was just Bitcoin talk. And that is not a good place to learn about something. There, you really had to spend like hours parsing through all those forum threads, and the content was mediocre at best. And then came the wave of Reddit, and then like early publications like CoinDesk, and then over the last 2 years, it's been a lot of Medium and Twitter. I think that's nice because the iteration on content on Twitter is extremely high, and the level of content producers has definitely come up a notch. I think in terms of like very eloquent, very well-spoken sort of people back in the early days of Bitcoin, there was maybe one, like Andreas Antonopoulos, and now we have dozens or hundreds. So I'm pretty excited, and I'm pretty optimistic that we'll be able to compress the narrative into a tight enough payload to where that payload can reach the stratosphere and kind of hit mass adoption or like mass resonant frequency. For example, most people aren't going to agree with libertarian ideology, but maybe freedom is the narrative that works. And I'm excited to see all of us try to find that narrative that's going to really, really hit that pitch. And so I think that's just a matter of time. It's not really necessary for Bitcoin's adoption, or like at least Bitcoin's price movement. But I think I would prefer Bitcoin to draw in retail, the middle and lower income classes across the world. I would prefer that it draws more of them in before we have big institutional flows. But just based on a pure ownership perspective, but Bitcoin doesn't really care, and it doesn't really matter because Bitcoin's going to do Bitcoin.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. One of the things that even only in the last 2 or 3 years being in it intensely, even as over that period, we've noticed the narrative start changing, where people are actually talking more around the fundamentals of it and how that fits into the existing kind of ecosystem that we live in today. And that narrative, and more and more the kind of Austrian fundamentals that sit behind that, even though people who don't know anything about it or about Austrian economics actually are talking more like Austrian economists, which I'm finding fascinating. And that's certainly for me accelerated over the last 2 to 3 years.
Yeah, I think, at a minimum, people will give Austrian School of Economics a thought, because Bitcoin has survived 10 years with that monetary policy. So it's sort of like you don't have to, you can go, I don't believe in Austrian School of Economics. And you're like, well, here's Bitcoin. So you can't really deny it. It's 10 years worth of actual data. This isn't a research report written by someone who works at a Ivy League school, by an economist at an Ivy League school. This is real data. So I don't know how long you'll need it to run before you finally, acquiesce and finally give in. But certainly you're on the wrong side if you think you're right now.
So as we're sort of on the topic of narratives, and I think there's so some of the work that you've put out there, the research and the articles that you've written, I think my favourite ones are probably the Planting Bitcoin series, which is probably the one that you're most well known for. That for me is a really nice and simple way of putting it. Going through the soil, the season, and all the other things. It'd be great if you could take us through that shortly. But I think one of the most powerful things in the entire series is that table, is the comparison table where you list the different traits of money. Because not many people think about this. People don't really. They just assume that money is what they use to buy stuff, and that's it. But if you list the different traits of money, and then you compare them against the paper money we have today, gold, and then Bitcoin, and you kind of lay a case for Bitcoin effectively being, I think as we started out at the beginning, the strongest form of money, or the apex predator, and that really certainly helped crystallize my understanding of a narrative in the space. Could you give us a bit more background to that, where it came from and how you came up with the concept, and whether there was an entire team and research group behind it, or whether it was just you in a dark room for months and months crafting it?
Well, I want to give credit to some people that helped incept the idea. I went down a ski trip with Melton and Jill Carlson, and we were driving back, and Jill was like, Satoshi's brilliance was, yes, they was in the code, but his brilliance was also in his go-to-market strategy, and that really resonated with me. I was like, he was a brilliant marketer. Also fit within my mental model of how I think about the world, right? I've done growth marketing, growth products. So for me, that kind of hit like a chord. And so I started to think about it, and I pulled together, for 4 months, I would read Medium articles, I'd look through my Twitter bookmarks, and threw all those together into one giant doc. And then that sort of self-assimilated into sections, and then it kind of just clicked. I'm like, okay, the best analogy for this is that Satoshi's brilliance wasn't just in the species of tree that he chose to plant, the genetic code. It was the season, the soil, and the gardening techniques that were equally as important to Bitcoin's success. And to dive in on the species component, if you think of currencies as organisms, what genetic code they have eventually manifests itself via traits, and those traits of money are what give these different monies survivability. And if we look at these traits, you have, for example, durability is a trait. So gold is very, very durable. It doesn't rust. It doesn't degrade over time. It's got to be fungible. So 1 unit of gold is worth 1 unit of gold. Same with Bitcoin, same with the dollar. It has to be transportable. It has to be divisible. Essentially, it needs to scale from small payments to large payments. And so there's all these different traits of money. And when we look across this chart of different traits, Bitcoin has the best traits as money. And those traits that it has give it a very lethal component. In terms of an evolutionary standpoint, it is the apex predator. It has the most advantageous genetic code, which manifests itself via traits that ensures its survivability and also threatens the existence of the other species of money, given their poorer genetic traits, their poorer genetic code, which manifests itself via traits. So, there's some things to where gold just cannot compete long term. And here's a great example. On asteroids, there is a very large amount of gold. I think some people have seen these terms where asteroids are valued at like $2 trillion or $20 trillion because of all the precious metals that they have on them. So given the probability that we become a spacefaring species, which if you don't believe that, then you must believe that the world's going to end, then at some point gold is not tenable as a currency because there's no way we're going to add additional weight to spaceships just for a metal that represents value. It's going to have to be digital. And so with gold kind of eliminated long-term as a potential, that's one example of many different traits that Bitcoin has that's superior than gold is. For example, it's weightless and can be transported immediately across the world or across planets. You can transfer Bitcoin to Mars or the moon. The moon, you wouldn't necessarily need to use like a layer 2 scaling solution, but with Mars, you'd have to open up a lightning channel. But Bitcoin scales beyond planets.
So what I'm taking away here, Dan, is that you're saying Bitcoin started off in soil and emerged sort of through some green shoots and is now literally going to the moon. That's the main thing I'm taking away.
Yes, that's one way to interpret it, yes.
So is that so one of the classic kind of media challenges, and I think we are it's really disheartening to see the media coverage. It's getting slowly better, but the media in general doesn't really understand Bitcoin or even money in the way that actually people like yourself and in the space really do. So a lot of the narratives and the things that come out in the press are just terrible. One of the key things that we quite often hear is, look, Bitcoin's the first. Bitcoin's the first iteration of digital money. That the first is rarely the one that succeeds. Look at MySpace, Facebook, that kind of example. What's the best way to dispel that kind of a view? And because you said there that Bitcoin's the best form of money, it's the apex predator. What happens when an even more fierce, ferocious predator comes along?
Well, it's sort of saying like, I think there's a lot of people that use analogies like, oh, is it the MySpace, the Facebook? I think it's more around, this isn't just a social network where you can switch and there's zero cost. This is something you store your money into. You spend the time to learn about it and you store your money into it, and it requires a certain amount of belief. So I think that gives Bitcoin very strong network effects. And Bitcoin's network effect relative to other crypto assets, if you look at Google search trends, and look at Bitcoin versus, let's say, the number 2 one, Ethereum, and you look at the search volume for buy Bitcoin or buy Ethereum, which that query is, I think, a more narrow, better defined query because that shows intent to buy, which is essentially the demand side. It's 7x the amount of volume. So, Bitcoin has the largest number of current hodlers. It has the strongest philosophy around what the protocol is meant to do. Bitcoin's core protocol is supposed to enables it to be Gold 2.0, which has very strong protocol market fit or product market fit with those seeking to use it. It's a great way to store money into a ledger that is impossible to mute if you want to send it to someone else and is extremely hard to seize. And that has a good value prop for a lot of people across the world. And these other crypto assets, either going after that use case or going after other ones, if they're going after other use cases, those have largely been to be determined if those are actually valuable. Bitcoin's use case, I think, is the highest TAM and the most valuable one to go after. If you rebuild the capital markets, that's an incredible amount of money and an incredible amount of total addressable market. And so I think, if you're competing with Bitcoin, you have to compete with not only its genetic code, so the code itself, you have to compete with its launch strategy and its perceived fairness and its mythology and its Lindy effect of surviving for 10 years. And so, for example, Satoshi stayed pseudonymous, which meant that anyone could project whatever they wanted Satoshi to be. Whereas if you have a founder, that those founders, positive qualities and negative qualities will be highlighted, which decreases the social scalability of the protocol. And then you have like the launch strategy. Bitcoin didn't have value for a year and a half, so those coins circulated freely, and almost everyone had agreed Bitcoin's launch is the most fair, versus every other launch, which is perceived to be tainted as having some sort of unfairness to it. And then finally, like Bitcoin has a very unique characteristic where it has horizontal gene transfer, where if it sees genetic code in other species of money that it likes, it can absorb that code. So Bitcoin doesn't just stay static. It is constantly evolving to be the apex predator. And it's evolving in a way because it's evolving in a way to where it's not going to just add any new genetic code that looks cool. It's going to only add genetic code that has been proven to be useful in its survivability as money.
Yeah, and it also has the ability to see what others have tested in their methods and apply it in a different matter. See the result, as you say, the A/B testing. It can see the A/B testing that other products do, and affect the kind of input those tests on its own protocol.
Precisely. Yeah, it can look at genetic code that looks to be performing well, or at least is interesting, and can take that and absorb it. And so, given the massive network effect, plus that capability, plus its perceived fairness, plus a bunch of other factors, it'd be really hard to take out the number one currency. And
so many people talk about one of two projections, one of a projection over the next year or 2 years, the 12 to 24 month view, or when we get there in 50, 100, whatever it is, years time, this is what it will be. Based on that, kind of those points, what does 10 years from now look like for you? Let's pick a midway ballpark. If we were to think about Bitcoin at its 20-year anniversary, what do you think it looks like?
Yeah, I think by that time, institutions will have definitely bought in on a very wide basis. I think most hedge funds, investment, sovereign wealth funds, pension funds will own Bitcoin. I think it would be negligent of them not to. And so that will mark a very distinct moment because Bitcoin will have moved from being viewed as worthless, derided as just used for money launderers and drug dealers, to being owned by every prestigious individual or entity in the world. And that is an incredible achievement to do in under 20 years, especially with a new asset class, with new technology or semi-new technology. And so I think, in that moment, I think when they all hold it, Bitcoin at that moment will have at least presented itself as a good challenger to gold, which is an incredible achievement. But that's not where it stops. Its ultimate goal is to suck in all the assets of the world and to become the safe haven asset to absorb gold, fiat currency, some real estate. And so that's going to take decades and decades to do. as Bitcoin slowly eats into the consciousness of the world and slowly chips away at the fake trust that we've all lent these institutions, where they've continually breached that trust. And that's Satoshi's first writing after the white paper. In the first paragraph, he talks about that, where he goes, history is full of central banks breaching that trust. It's full of banks breaching that trust with fractional reserve lending. And so Bitcoin was presented as the antidote. And over time, I think with these waves by 2020, we'll have by 2030? We'll have the 2020 halving event, the 2024 halving event, 2028. So I would expect Bitcoin to be worth, 10 plus trillion and have really, really penetrated the consciousness of society and kind of challenged a lot of the assumptions that we previously had.
Well, it's that point. It's potentially that point. Actually, 2030 is potentially that point where it starts becoming a store of value, where it becomes a measurement of account, and actually a true measurement of account, where people actually would take it seriously.
Yeah, I think. Yeah, it's sort of like the part of the Bitcoin community that fractured into Bcash. They often think that Bitcoin is their perceived value for Bitcoin is its use in payments. And I think that around that age is when payments really make sense, as that value stabilizes, because there's no way we can smooth that intraday volatility. And so once that happens, it can become a medium of exchange and a unit of account, increasing its network effects and increasing its stickiness. Yeah,
because it's the bigger challenge now is actually how do we fix or how do we right all of the wrongs? It's not necessarily how do we create this new payment type. It's actually how do we re-baseline or re-benchmark how we value things across the globe, and kind of start fresh from that with that regard.
Yeah, exactly. It's how do we rebuild the capital markets? How do we rebuild the financial system? And Satoshi set out the original roadmap for Bitcoin's product. And he was like, look, we can't just start with like making cheap payments. We have to start with rebuilding what money is. And then from there, we can rebuild everything else.
So I love how unapologetic and quite sort of straight you are about this, Dan. I think it really sort of aligns with our views as well. And it's great to hear that. I think there's a couple of things we were hoping we could throw at you as we're sort of approaching the end, that typically come up in the media. So coming back to that point around media coverage and the fact that it's disappointing. What would you say to anyone writing articles that state that Bitcoin wastes energy? Bitcoin is a useless resource and waste of electricity and power.
Yeah. So when I first got into Bitcoin when I first started building products in Bitcoin in 2013, my first product was the first newsfeed aggregator in crypto. So we took at the time CoinDesk didn't exist, so we scraped the subreddit r/Bitcoin, the hot thread. So that's in 2013 I probably read every single headline. Literally every single headline. So I've kind of been very, very much disillusioned with the media since then, and I've tried to pick apart why, and I think it's largely due to. Look, I get it. You guys are great writers, you're great narrative creators, and you stitch together a complex narrative, and you have to do it in an afternoon, and you got to crank out 3 of those. But I think some are it's kind of intentionally misleading in a way, and I'm a little bit. I think they should look at their core journalistic qualities and go, what are my ethics as a journalist? What's my responsibility? And your responsibility is to report the truth. And if you want to be responsible as a journalist and look at yourself in the mirror, then you can't just say like, oh, I saw headlines in 2013 where they're like, oh, you can print as much as you want, or just ridiculous stuff. Yeah. And I think you should really look at yourself and go, do I feel that I'm acting ethically as a journalist, or am I actually seeking the truth? And, don't be mad if you get berated on Twitter when you report something absolutely fucking absurd. It's really annoying. And it's like, you've had a decade to learn it. And I get it. You might have just been assigned this. It's your new beat. Well, reach out to some people that know. And I know they do that. They build out a network of different individuals that they rely on, but they are the experts. You are not the expert. We are. We build things. We spend much more time digging into this than you do. We know what's going on. Just like any other industry, the people that work in ride sharing, well, it's the people that build ride sharing tools that know what's going on. And so lean on us heavily, really take the effort to cross-examine different data, different sources. One side's going to tell you one thing, one side's going to tell you the other. This is your time to shine. This is what you came here for, was to report on something and to report a narrative. And the narrative can be really compelling. There's a lot of cool stories in the crypto space, but I think like when we see these egregious breaches of trust around basic journalistic ethics, it's just like, well, I've lost all faith in your ability to report on anything now.
I completely agree. And I think there was a very famous and large global news outlet that was revealed as paying more for the number of clicks that journalists would write. So they're incentivized to write clickbait headlines and poorly and more sensationalist articles because it just got more eyeballs on it and they got more money as a result. So that certainly doesn't help either. Okay, but let's say you are in front of a camera. Well, you're in front of a microphone, but you've got 10 seconds to reply to the next three questions. So coming back to the first one there, how would you rebut against Bitcoin wastes energy as a statement?
Bitcoin, like every other currency in the world, requires energy to be created, just like gold mining or the existing financial system. It uses magnitudes less electricity than those do. And given that you have never criticized anyone else in your life that when they use electricity to watch the Kardashians or to eat their hamburger, why do you think that you're morally justified now to say that someone is wasting electricity by using it for Bitcoin? They paid for that electricity. They deserve to use it in whatever fashion they see fit.
Bitcoin can't scale.
We have evidence that it can with layer 2 Lightning that is currently on mainnet. Lightning essentially enables an incredibly, it's hard to calculate because it's 400 transactions per second per channel, and that's per channel open. So we're talking scaling. Bitcoin can scale to absorbing Visa, MasterCard, and all the other payment processors if we wanted it to with Lightning.
Okay, but the thing is, Dan, Bitcoin is used for money laundering.
Bitcoin, just like the internet, can be used for good or bad things.
But I'm a bad actor, and I'm also going to hack it and steal all the money.
Yeah, we wouldn't turn off the internet, though, and we're not going to turn off Bitcoin. So some people are going to use it for bad. Some people are going to use it for good. We can certainly help police some of those activities on the endpoints, which can be the exchanges or different wallets.
Amazing. That's the end of our lightning round. Thank you, Dan. And just on a point there, actually, you raised, I've often wondered whether anybody's done any analysis into things like Candy Crush. How much energy does Candy Crush use on people's smartphones? And you multiply that around people around the world, and just games that really don't give much back. But I guess you almost answered that question in your response to Bitcoin, saying, well, it's none of our business. If you as a consumer are paying your electricity bills, then you can use that electricity however you see fit.
Yes, exactly. It's kind of funny because Bitcoin's electricity usage is just so explicit. That's why it makes people uncomfortable versus everything else, which is really hard to quantify.
Perfect. So, look, Dan, we are about out of time. And there's one question that we tend to ask all of our guests at the end of the interview. This is the Crypto and Grill podcast, and the 2020 Halvening barbecue is taking place at your house/ranch in Texas. What are you going to stick on the barbecue to feed all of the Bitcoin Twitter personalities, guests, and people that are going to descend on your property? Okay,
well, I'm going to say something that the carnivore community might not like as much, but it's gonna be filet mignon. So that was what I had for the steak. But man, I'm a big surf and turf fan, so we're gonna be throwing lobster on there too.
That's good. I thought you were gonna go veggie for a moment or vegan, no, that's fine. Excellent. Look, thank you very much. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you, and we would hopefully love to buy you dinner at some point in San Francisco or in London if you're over here. So continue the conversation then.
If you're listening to this, you are the resistance.